Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this special 21st Century Periods event being hosted by the National Library of Scotland. Today, we're joined by viewers from all over the world, including India, Canada, and Chile, but most importantly by our two speakers from St Andrews. Bettina Bildhauer is Professor of Modern Languages, and Camilla Røstvik is Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the School of Art History. Both contribute to the Royal Society of Edinburgh-funded Ending Period Poverty project, and so are amongst the clued up people in the nation when it comes to all things periods. Today, they're going to bring us up to speed with the art and activism inspired by menstruation, the enduring shame and stigma of the time of the month, and Scotland's trailblazing period poverty bill. They're also keen to have a good conversation at the end, so please start sending in your questions using the function as they occur to you. Okay, over to you both.
Hello everyone, I'm Bettina Bildhauer. Thank you for this great introduction, Non, and thank you for the invitation. It's a slightly surreal event. I'm still getting used to a brave new word, but I hear there's 150 of you from all over the world. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the NLS for hosting. We're going to do a little bit of a double-hander, so I'll start by trying to answer some of the questions that the event advertising promised you. So first, very basically, what is menstruation? What is this thing that we're not usually talking about? Then why is it so stigmatized still and always has been? And what is changing in Scotland right now, which are very exciting developments. I'll then hand over to my colleague Camilla, who will talk to you a little bit more about attempts to challenge the stigma by artists and activists. So we'll try to end on a positive note. And then we've left lots and lots of time for all your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. So what is menstruation? Well, we usually think of it as the roughly monthly bleed that occurs in most women and other people who menstruate of a certain age. So the term menstruation comes from the Latin menses, for month. That's all it is. But actually, it's part of a much wider menstrual cycle that entails lots and lots of changes that affect the whole of our anatomy and physiology. So it's 4 different hormones who change their levels over the course of 3 to 5 weeks. And that affects everything from our ability to exercise, our muscle strength and stamina, our ability to process food, our nutritional needs, our smell, our mood, how we sleep. So it has a huge impact on the entire body, and fixing just on that bleed is not going to answer our questions about what's going on in the body. A regular cycle, though, is considered a sign of good health of the body, and academics and activists are now arguing that we should see it as the 5th vital sign because it gives us such a good indicator when there's something out of balance. It's an early indicator of trouble in the body. So it should really be taken more seriously medically. What comes out during this menstrual bleed is not actually blood, it's the uterine lining. So I'm sure you all noticed that it builds up over the course of several weeks in case there's a fertilized egg that needs to embed. When that doesn't happen, the hormone levels decrease and the lining gets shed again. So what comes out is actually a mixture of skin of this lining, mucus, various fluids, and a bit of blood, but because it's red, we just use the shorthand blood. The average is about 35 milliliters, so about one egg cup full, although it can vary very widely, or depending on the individuals. Now, menstruation is very often associated with femininity, but that's not actually strictly true. So not all women bleed, and not everyone who bleeds menstrually is a woman. So non-binary folk, trans folk also bleed. And of course, over the life cycle, a lot of people have periods where they don't bleed. So the first menstrual bleeding is usually referred to as menarche, occurs at puberty, and the final one is 12 months before the menopause, which is one particular day. So both very young and older people don't menstruate, although they still, of course, have hormones and hormonal fluctuation. Pregnant people don't menstruate, people who breastfeed, people with medical problems, lots of people on hormonal medication don't bleed, especially on contraception. So it's not something that is maybe as widespread as we think it is. There's another bit of a misconception that menstruation is directly linked to fertility. So menstruation is a good indicator for fertility, but just because you've had your first period doesn't mean the whole menstrual cycle is in place and you can in fact conceive. In the same way, the menopause doesn't mean you can't become pregnant anymore. If you use a donor egg, then the menstruation is the lack of menstruation is no bar to this. So there's not a direct correlation. The purpose of it is actually surprisingly little studied, apart from this preparation for pregnancy, so that a menstrual bleed is then seen as a failed pregnancy. So it's couched in quite negative terms. However, it's only us primates who have this monthly period, which means that probably there is a massive evolutionary advantage to this. Other mammals have much larger, longer cycles. So there's probably a lot more research to be done until we've understood what this cycle is actually for, why it gives us such superiority. Now, why is this event, which is actually, you know, quite a good thing for a lot of people, essential for the survival of the species, why is that so stigmatized? And so I'm not a medical professional, I'm a historian, and a medieval historian in particular, and I can tell you that the roots of this stigma go a long way back. As far as we know in history, there's always been menstrual stigma in the global north. So when we start having written records of ancient religions, what became dominant in the global north is monotheism, and even, you know, ancient Judaism already had various menstrual prohibitions that then were taken up by medieval Christianity and ancient Christianity and Islam as well. So it's very widespread across the religions, and crucially also medicine. So ancient medicine also believed that menstruation was essentially very powerful and very dangerous. So this is a kind of medicine that was developed in ancient Greece, and that sort of survived and was adapted in Arabic and then Latin, and again became dominant throughout Europe in the pre-modern period. And basically their conception of the body was as a container of fluids, where the balance of fluids made sure that you were healthy and that everything was functioning. And any bleeding really was a bit of a danger, was a breach of this sort of whole container and a bit of a crisis. And this particularly applied to menstrual bleeding because it was seen as uncontrollable. Women couldn't consciously control how they bled and when they bled, and therefore it was seen as particularly dangerous. So according to this ancient Greek way of thinking that has survived, menstrual bleeding is something that is in itself dangerous, that can also, the blood itself can also pollute others. So there were all these beliefs that now strike us as crazy about menstrual blood being poisonous, in particular to men and children, being able to damage crops, harm plants, stain mirrors, if a menstruating person only looks at them. So only men were seen as being able to ever have a perfect, contained, continent, non-bleeding body, and women and others who menstruate were excluded from this. In addition to this, it was seen as a bit of a secret. So educated medical men knew the secrets of menstruation and of female reproduction, whereas women tried to hide them and tried to keep them secret. So this structure, although we think of ourselves as having moved on from this ancient type of medicine, humoral medicine, this same structure really has still survived, that something that bleeds is still perceived as a crisis, is still perceived as a wound, as potentially dangerous, and at the same time as really powerful, because there is this link to fertility. So something that's life and death and really to be mistrusted. And what's also survived is this power structure of seeing menstruation as something that's kind of shamefully hidden by us women who do it, who have it, and that speaking about it and sharing knowledge about it is really a separate, superior domain. So very briefly, that's kind of where the stigma comes from And the reason it still survived is because the power structures are essentially still the same. The male body is still seen as the standard in drugs trials, for instance, you know, in so many different ways, and the female body is the deviation, the sort of inferior form that kind of gets added on. It's like, it's really quite incredible that it still goes on in modern medicine. However, in better news, things are changing a little bit in Scotland, right here, right now, wherever you are. We're in Scotland and we're moving on. So Scotland is the first country who is on course to enshrine in law the right to free period products. So there's been various initiatives in various countries, notably Kenya, of making period products freely available to those who need them. And that is already happening in Scotland as well. So we've already got period products being provided for free in toilets, in schools, colleges, universities, hospitals, prisons. Some employers have come on board and are doing it off their own back now, for instance, the National Library of Scotland itself. But no other country has gone so far as to make this provision a law. So make it a right enshrined in law to have access to these products. That's really a major development. How did we get here? So there's been a lot of lobbying from various sides, various activist groups, in particular the Girl Guides, initiatives like On the Ball, sports clubs, various groups have really been campaigning for this. Commercial enterprises have come on board providing the products. Political parties have started lobbying for this. So this is a bill that was proposed by an MSP, by a member of parliament, Monica Lennon, but that has gained cross-party support. So it was voted through the first stage unanimously with one abstention from all the parties. It feeds in with various other agendas that are going on in Scotland politically at the moment. So it really helps the general anti-poverty agenda that the Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament has at the moment, as well as the desire to do things differently from England and to be a world leader in its own right. So it's really great progress. It's really exciting times. We Non mentioned that we are both Camilla and I are part of a project looking into these changes in Scotland, funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, called Ending Period Poverty. And one of the issues that we have with all this great work that's happening now is that it still really leaves the stigma intact. Despite the accompanying campaign, Let's Call Periods Periods, despite really genuine efforts by so many people, the stigma is so deep rooted that it's still there. And that's because this still casts menstruation, this initiative, this free access to period as a dignity issue, still casts menstrual bleeding as something that's shameful and that needs to be managed, that in essence needs to be hidden. And that's why people need access to these products in order to not be seen with socks or with stains in their trousers. So the basic premise that menstruation is a problem hasn't changed. And it also hasn't changed that power dynamic that those who menstruate are always the others. They're the young, they're the poor, the female, the sick, the imprisoned, who are somewhere in need of help, and never us who are kind of talking about it and wanting to help there. So I'm going to hand over at this stage to end with some examples of activists and artists who've tried to tackle the stigma and come up with different ways of talking about and seeing menstruation. Camilla.
Hi, thank you, Bettina. So I'm hoping everyone can hear me. It's very nice to be here in my bedroom and to virtually meet all of you. So I'm going to kind of pick up where Bettina ended and look at a lot of art and visual representations of menstruation. So to do that, I'm going to share my screen. So I'll disappear and you should see some images quite soon. Okay, so I'm hoping you can see a nice big screen with an image on it now. And I'm sure our lovely tech support in the background will let me know if not. So I wanted to start with this image because I think it really takes us from what Bettina was talking about into the 20th and 21st century. How did this old, deep-seated, complex problem progress with us into living times? And this visual component that Bettina talked about, this problem that we can talk about menstruation like we are now, we can create policy and products, but it's that visual taboo of seeing the blood and other symptoms that sticks with us. Well, many of us anyways. So this leaflet is from the 40s, between the 40s and 50s, and it was made by Boot, so a kind of corporate output to educate girls in the right way to menstruate. And you can see here that even the visual rendering of this leaflet, it shows an old-fashioned line drawing on your left, the old way of menstruating with a corset, not washing yourself, lying in bed. That's bad. According to this leaflet, you should be normal now. You should have exercise. You should hang around with men. You should be naked in the bathtub. That's the right way to menstruate. And I think it really illustrates this myth that a lot of us tend to maybe tell ourselves, that we're getting beyond this old way of thinking, because we're always saying it was worse before and it's better now, we're more modern now because we have products. So at the heart of a lot of this is an industry, really, and that's not talked about, I think, enough. It's profitable to keep menstruation hidden. We have products, we have advertising, we have quiet wrappers, we have the sanitary bin industry. And all of these really profit from the consumer's interest in hiding menstruation. And there's good reason to hide menstruation. There's really no, if you were to be seen as menstruating, there's nothing positive to be gained from that in most societies. So we can understand why we kind of buy into this. And in the vacuum of never seeing realistic representation, this is the kind of images that certainly in the global north have come to stand in for menstruation. Because you don't see it, this is what you get instead, which is basically products. And there's been a shift in recent years, a shift in Scotland, yes, but also a shift in the broader world, where advertisers in particular have responded to a call from consumers who say, we don't want that blue liquid anymore, we don't want the myths, and we want better representation in the advertising. So that's kind of an activist call to arms that advertisers have taken up. And I'm showing you a couple of examples here, notably that red liquid image from Bodyform in the corner. And you can see that the media has boosted this. There has been more written about menstruation in the last 5 years than, in the last 100 years in terms of cultural analysis. And all of this is on the back of the work that a lot of artists and activists have done. So I want to show you some artwork and kind of see how these things are linked, and how sometimes advertisers and artists, they have the same goal, but they do their work, of course, in different ways. But the goal here is to destigmatize the visual rendering of menstruation. And I should have said at the top that I'm going to be showing images of menstrual art, right? So there's going to be images of blood. And of course, me saying that is part of the problem. Should I be telling you that? Should I be giving you a warning? Or should I pretend that the stigma doesn't exist? So we can discuss that. Now, also a quick reminder, this is kind of what menstrual visual culture used to look like. People used to make these products, or didn't use products at all. For example, in Scandinavia, homemade knitted cloth pads that you would reuse. Other countries, other cultures, different homemade options. So just to say that we're talking about 100-year history when this industry grew. It's 100 years. So it's not like we can't change things. It's been a short history. Tampax is one of these big brands that are still around, 100-year history, really interesting history. And they wrote, I think in the kind of 30s, although this memo is undated, that advertising such a sensitive topic to a national audience would require just the right touch, a combination of aggressive selling and delicate good taste. To say that quote is from the early 20th century, I think it still applies today. But our tastes have changed, on the back of the work of artists, and the aggressive selling tactic has also changed. So it used to look like this, right? This used to be the avant-garde and menstrual advertising, and we might laugh at it today, but they did a lot of work here to explain how to use a complicated, relatively taboo internal product. And look at all the skin on display here, almost suggesting that menstruation could be sexy. Now, maybe that's not a radical message today, but in the 30s, moving on to the 70s, perhaps it was, and perhaps that was part of the plan. So now I'm going to show you some artwork which will kind of shift the visual language a great deal. You can already see these images are different to what I've shown you. Artists beginning in the 70s were fed up with those images from Tampax and other corporate advertisers, and they wanted to show it as it was. They put blood on canvas, they photographed themselves, and they showed, as you can see here, how a tampon is actually used, and they made art from that. Very different visual language, very difficult for them to then be taken seriously as artists, which is a whole other conversation. But nevertheless, they're doing a lot of work for us here, showing us perhaps what we're actually afraid to see. In later years, artists have kind of followed in their footsteps, calling attention to completely different causes. So whereas the 70s artists were doing it to really break with advertising tradition, modern living artists are they have a multifaceted approach to these issues. So Rupi Kaur, who was famously censored on Instagram, was initially just trying to make quite a beautiful series of self-portraits, normalizing bleeding. And she is maybe kind of in pain here, or maybe she is relaxing. It's a mystery for us to kind of think about. In Sarah Maple's self-portrait, Menstruate with Pride, we see a different politics. Here, of course, it's the artist as superhero, trying to not think about what other people think, with a little girl looking on intriguingly. In the corner, you see this thumbprint from South African artist Sanele Moholi, who documents the violence done towards queer and trans people, and especially lesbians in South Africa. So each time this happens, they document it with a blood work from their own body. So that's kind of a message of sorrow, of grief, perhaps even healing, and certainly documenting history. And taking this all the way up to the present, Sarah Levy's Whatever Bloody Trump, which is a response to then presidential candidate Donald Trump's views on menstruation, which is that they might make women kind of irresponsible or something like that. So again, a political outlet. So you can see that artists today, they're still grappling with this, showing us many different ways to think about menstruation, not just that sanitized vision of the past and of advertising. Okay, so I will leave it there and I will stop sharing my screen. And I think we would love to go into questions. Thank you.
Okay, me again. Thank you both so much. That was really interesting, although that work of art by the South African artist was pretty harrowing, but thank you for some thought-provoking slides and images there. Okay, me and my colleague Mike are going to do a tag team for the Q&A. So Mike, over to you for the first question.
Yeah, okay, here we go. We've got a few coming in. First of all, yeah, I just want to say also that was really interesting, and it was yeah, really interesting to see all that, how the artwork has changed over the years. And the first question we've got is kind of related to that. It's from Vicky Chapman, who says, it's kind of a comment, but maybe you guys want to talk about it. It just says, Bodyform's current Womb Stories campaign is really inspirational. Yeah, I wondered if either of you wanted to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I have seen that. I don't know if everyone who's here has seen it. It's worth taking a look at. So Bodyform has been engaged in this kind of rebranding of itself the last 5 years, starting with being the first company to show blood in an advertisement for menstrual products, and then menstrual-ish blood, although it's not menstrual blood, of course, but food coloring, and then peaking with this kind of mini film, which shows many ways in which people might menstruate, it includes stories of menopause and being child-free and having children and infertility, everything to do with the kind of political womb or whatever. I also agree that it's a really interesting film and moving, and I just kind of flag up there, we have to remember that it was made by artists, right? They collaborate a lot with artists, but it is a company. And I think in this landscape, it's really important to remember that corporations are not activists. That doesn't mean they can't work with artists, but we have to kind of remember that. I think Bodyform, which is an outrun of Essity, which is a Swedish company, has an interesting story of itself, and a complicated story like all these corporations. So well worth watching it, but remember who made it and what they're trying to sell. That's what I would say.
Great. Did you want to go ahead with the next one, Laura?
Yeah, I really like this question, so I'm going to pluck it out and ask it. Are there any cultures which celebrate menstruation?
Bettina, do you want to? I'll just go ahead with the first thing that comes to mind. That's such a good question, because I wonder if it's more about time than cultures. From what I know of the history of menstruation, and there's so much here that needs to be written. I mean, most of it is not written. At some point in time, in most cultures, well, in many cultures, what's written, yes, it would have been, if not celebrated, then valued as fertility or marker of something. So what I've looked at most is Scandinavia. So certainly it was a marker of strength in some Scandinavian cultures, and in the indigenous Sami culture, there's all sorts of traditions and mythology about it. And although I wouldn't maybe call it celebration, a value of it as a powerful force. But we need more historians to find more ways to answer that question, I'd say. Bettina, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree. There's always, there isn't one attitude that one culture has to menstruation. So we've highlighted some of the voices of artists who are going against that dominance of negative stereotypes around menstruation. And that's true historically as well. So there were female gynecologists in the Middle Ages even who knew that, who saw menstruation as something really positive, as part of the strength to give birth. One of the euphemisms that was used in that period was flowers. So we have texts surviving that counteract this dominant view of menstruation as something dangerous and polluting. So I would say every culture in itself is super nuanced, and there's always voices against the mainstream. Great question.
Well, just to follow up on that question, actually, there's another one for you, Bettina, that just says, could you tell us more about how periods were thought about in medieval times? I think it's just
I know, I love this. You did ask. You will not be able to shut me up about this. So yeah, I mean, there was a plurality of voices around this. So not everyone stigmatized menstruation and saw it as negative. But one overwhelmingly, the Middle Ages were a very gender segregated society, and menstruation was seen as part of a biological weakness of women that they couldn't overcome, and by making it biological and medical, that really held them down. And one of the more obscure or maybe weird points is that there were also lots of medieval texts that claim that Jewish men menstruated. So again, like, it's not entirely tied to biological gender, it's more tied to not granting people access to the ideal body, because Jewish men were seen as not being able to control their bodies, much like women weren't.
Okay, thank you very much. An interesting question here from Kate. She asks whether you think menopause is also portrayed negatively or in a stigmatized way.
Absolutely, you can't win, right? Like, bleeding is bad, not bleeding is bad. It's both seen as a sign of weakness, a sign of incontinence, a sign of being out of control, not being in control of your emotions, being a hormonal wreck. And one of the points that menstrual researchers are making a lot currently is that we need to look at the whole life cycle and see it in the context of changes over an individual's life, and basically not being able to escape the role of somehow stigmatized by this bleeding or lack of bleeding.
Yeah, and if I can just add, I think the menopause taboo or whatever it's kind of coming hot on the heels of all this debate about menstruation. So menstruation is often framed as only about young people, right? That's who you see in the advertising, young girls, right? But it's of course something that follows you for a long time. It can do. And it seems that there's a lot of activity going on around menopause that was happening around menstruation maybe 5 years ago. So you have activist groups, like I'm thinking about Menopause Cafe. That's almost like a consciousness raising group, getting people together who experience this, whether through surgery or natural or whatever, to just talk about it. And that's kind of what was happening 5 years ago with menstruation. And then you saw this flood of advertising and interest from the media. So I'm a commercialization of the menopause with more products, for example. But I mean, maybe that's part of breaking the taboo, right?
Yeah, there's a question that kind of links to some of that. But Zhao Yu has asked, it's been 2 years since schools provided free menstrual products in Scotland. What has been the impact on, say, poverty, attendance rate and environment, etc.? So yeah, okay.
Well, I think we don't know. Maybe I mean, this is where it would have been great to kind of have the policymakers with us today, because they maybe are more on top of this, but we don't know yet. As far as I know, there's reports being written about how this worked, some of it disrupted by COVID, certainly because children haven't been at school at this crucial kind of pilot period for some schools and universities where it was rolled out later. But it's interesting, if we step away from Scotland for a moment, as Bettina was saying, Kenya has been doing this for a while, other countries, other parts of Canada, for example, have been doing this for a while. Is menstrual taboos, do they not exist in Canada or Kenya anymore? No. So I think policymakers are also aware that this is just part of the conversation. But it's a great question and something to kind of keep an eye on. Bettina, do you know more than me?
Yeah, no, I think it is hard to quantify. I mean, one of the people in our RSE Ending Period Poverty Project works for one of the charities that actually is tasked with handing out these products across the community through food banks largely, but also in prisons, hospitals, and so on. And from her descriptions, it's it's just a never-ending hole. However much you give, there's always more. So we are not suddenly on top of poverty in Scotland, and as a consequence also not on top of period poverty. There's been a part of the issue that's being debated in the bill just now in refining the text of the bill is how much actually does this cost, how much actually gets spent by the average person who menstruates per month or per year on products. And again, there's been a huge divergence in estimates, and I don't think that's been settled. But there is work ongoing on this, and as soon as the law has been rolled out, I think we'll know more.
Me again. So a more technical question maybe this time, but I think an interesting one. Are there any taboos or examples through history which speak specifically about the amount of menstrual blood? So is there an ideal amount? I know you mentioned there, Bettina, the egg cup. I've heard 2 tablespoons in the past. What's going on there?
That is a really interesting question. I think if they speak about amounts and try to quantify it, it's more in terms of days. How many days do you bleed? Not in terms of how much blood actually comes out. But it would be really interesting to know if historically it did actually change, right? If people do bleed more now. What's often said is that people didn't used to menstruate as often because they were more often pregnant, didn't live as long. I don't actually know that there is evidence for this, that that's been studied, but that's kind of the conjecture. But super interesting question. I'd love to know. I don't know of any research into this.
Well, I just kind of tag on there our colleague, Hilary Critchley, who works at the University of Edinburgh, right, Bettina? She's a real pioneer in the field, and is in the kind of medical world, and part of what they're trying to figure out is heavy menstrual bleeding, right? So they have a big research group trying to help people who have heavy, painful periods. But then the first thing they had to do was like define what is a heavy period, because patients would come in and say, I have a heavy period, and then, you know, they'd be like, well, that's very little. And then someone else would be, I have a small period, and they're bleeding out. So it's been interesting to listen to, I mean, if you're interested in that question, maybe it'd be interesting to see what's happening now with that research, because it seems to me that medics and gynecologists are still trying to define that. And it's of course because we don't see it. So you might know your own menstrual pattern and be worried if it changed, but you don't know anyone else's, and you know, maybe we don't want to know. But it does have that dangerous medical knock-on effect that actually there could be people who are really bleeding heavily and they have no idea. So that's, it's not quite to answer your question, but there's more information at Hilary Critchley's research group.
So again, slightly related to that one is a question about other gynecological issues. So as part of your ending period poverty work, can I ask, what do you enjoy most? And are you looking into lived experience in relation to the gynecological related issues such as endometriosis, PCOS, PMDD? The question says, I myself suffer from endometriosis and run a local support group in Edinburgh, in Scotland. Sorry.
Oh, that's great. I'd love to connect after this if we can find each other somehow. You know, we'd be really interested in talking to people who do local support groups as part of the project. And I think, yes, we are looking at lived experience, but we're trying to track the history here of this like historic moment of Scotland being, you know, allegedly the first and the best, and trying to get that history down in an international and historical perspective. But what often happens with that kind of history writing is that people's lived experience does get lost. And so we are working with some kind of charities, but Bettina, we haven't really looked at kind of pain and endo and that kind of stuff, have we, yet?
Yeah, but it's, you know, it is a really important topic. And, you know, a lot of people who think about menstruation and talk about menstruation, it's because it's not going well. You know, it can be really debilitating and horrible. And researching it, of course, you know, we also menstruate, but there's a lot of additional emotional labor in a topic like this. It's not, you know, it's not as easy to talk about as, I don't know, needlepoint or something. Not that needlepoint is necessarily pain-free, but, you know, like it's really important to acknowledge the kind of the emotional work that goes into the academic research, but also the activism. You know, we're super grateful for every single person who overcomes that shame and stigma and starts talking about it, male or female or something else.
Yeah, and these support groups like the one that you're running, you know, whoever you are, I can't see you, those things are so important. Like I mentioned, Menopause Cafe, there's been menstrual cafes, all of them kind of built around that original concept of like death cafes, like people actually getting together and talking about what they fear most or what's most horrible in their life. And that's, you know, that's the core of the activism on this point. You have to start comparing experiences, and that's kind of what you're doing. So, you know, thank you for doing that work. It's so important.
Just to say, they have shared their contact details with us. So yeah, we'll pass it on to you after the session.
Thank you.
And there was one answer. Sorry, there was one answer asking for our contact details of the network. So I've put the link in the chat there as well. We're called menstruationresearchnetwork.co.uk is our website, and you're very welcome to email us after this talk as well if you're trying to get in touch. These are amazing questions. I can see there's so many left in the chat.
Perfect, thank you. So next question from Ray, another one I really like. What do you suggest is the best way to teach more about periods to our young children, brackets, especially boys, for them to grow up appreciating it rather than being scared by it?
Talk about it openly and honestly is the best advice. So I've got a 7-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they just roll my eyes when I very openly talk about my periods again. But they've got friends, boys, where the mum says, "Oh, it's a bit of red Play-Doh in my pants," right? Because she's embarrassed to admit to it. And this is, she's a friend, she's a great woman. I'm not dismissing this, but you can, by kind of trying to be very discreet, perpetuate the stigma and perpetuate the idea that it's something that you shouldn't be talking about. But it is tricky because also, it's often linked to sexual education, and it needs to be linked to sexual education and to questions of consent. And you obviously want to do that in an age appropriate manner. So I haven't crossed that bridge quite yet, but the more open you can be, I think the better.
Great. So this is when I was trying to think of questions to ask you if no questions have come in. Obviously there are a lot of questions that come in, but this is one that I thought of, so I'm going to read it from but it's from Kate, who's asked the same question, which is: women and those who menstruate, who live together or work together, have cycles which tend to synchronize. It would be interesting to know about any research of regularity of menstruation during lockdown, I guess, and whether it's changed or not. Yeah, you might not be able to answer it, but it'd be interesting to hear your speculation.
Well, this is a bit like the heavy bleeding question, which is the thing about synchronizing periods. I mean, I'm not completely up on the latest kind of research there, but there is actually a lot of research, like comparatively to the problem. There is quite a bit that you can find of people who have researched this, which I think is interesting in itself. It doesn't seem to me to be a super priority to know whether women sync up or not, but maybe there's something I'm missing. So yes, there is research, and from what I've read, 50% say yes they do, and 50% say no, they don't sync up. I mean, so some people call that a myth, but there's still people engaged in research. And with COVID, I mean, I know what you're saying. It is interesting with synchronizing, but I think the underlying thing here is if periods change due to stress or grief, or the intense pressure that everyone is on in this pandemic, that's interesting, because we do know that there's a link between stress and menstruation, which has serious medical consequences. So maybe that's part of the sinking question that you're asking. And yes, I wish there was more research about that. But the question, the answer from us is always going to be there's not a lot of funding for answering these questions.
Okay, time for one more question. So we're almost running out of time. Thank you everybody for your questions. This has been a great discussion we've been able to have. This question is sort of about the intersection of periods with environmentalism and consumerism. It's asking whether you have any thoughts or observations on the relative lack of advertising for reusable period products.
Yeah, and there was a similar question about climate change as well. That's a massive shift that's going on. That's really helped to bring menstruation into the public eye, is the convergence of a maybe feminist agenda with an environmental agenda, and reusable products are becoming increasingly popular in the global north, and have social capital attached to them. They're seen as something cool to use, probably for the first time in the product's history. I don't know what you think, Camilla. So there's definitely a lot that's changing the conversation just now, and people are beginning to see non-reusable menstrual products as the environmental risk that it is. It's one of the largest contributing factors to marine pollution, because they get flushed down because people are embarrassed to even touch them and put them in the bin. So they just get flushed down the toilet and then end up washed in the sea. So yeah, that's where the future is going.
Yeah, just to add, if you're interested in that whole kind of social capital thing, our colleague Lara Owen has just written a fantastic PhD about this. So again, there's research that's going to come out soon about all of this environmental, the cup, what it means not to be able to use it, and whether you're a bad feminist or a horrible polluter then. But in terms of advertising, yes, that's a good question. It's because these small companies, they tend to want to be feminist and environmental, so they don't you know, they don't go to bed with the big advertising companies, and they don't want to spend on that. They want to spend on innovation and product, and they don't have as much funding as your Procter and Gamble, right? So it's word of mouth for those smaller companies and people who you know, seek it out actively, environmentalists, feminists, and so on. So it's going to take some time, I think. And what's very interesting is to see the big corporations following. So Procter and Gamble has bought an organic company, and they've also launched a Tampax cup. So, you know, who's going to get there first? It depends on the consumer and the price point, I would say.
Okay.
Great.
So, yeah, once again, thank you both so much for taking time out to speak to us all. It's been really refreshing to have a nice, open, honest conversation about a lot of these things. I'm sure many of our attendees will agree. But yeah, just to recap, it's the Menstruation Research Network that you want to go and look at if you're interested to know more about Camilla and Bettina's work. And of course, we're the National Library of Scotland. Come and visit us again soon when it's safe to do so. But thank you very much, and good evening, everybody.